So today, just for fun, I'm going to make my own skills for Path of Exile. The idea here is to solve some problems that I've observed in the game, and try to do my best to look at things from a game dev perspective on how new skills are designed. Now again, to be clear, I don't work for Grinding Gear Games, I'm not a designer or game dev, and so this is all just me theory crafting for fun. So the first problem that I want to solve is twofold. There is no chaos-based brand skill currently. The best you could do would be something like Decay's Stormbrand. And also, while Wither is very easy to apply with Withering Step, it requires you to use a very janky move skill setup whereby your Wither eats a charge from your Flame Dash or your Frost Blink, locking you out of movement. So, to solve this, let me introduce my first skill, a Chaos Brand duration spell called Entropic Brand. Entropic Brand will attach to an enemy and then activate to deal chaos damage. It will have a fairly high base crit at 7%, and fairly moderate damage and moderate effectiveness of added damage. In terms of numbers here, I'm not really quite sure what to go with, as I want this to be a skill that can be used for both a chaos hit-based build and also a chaos poison damage over time build. So I was having a little trouble picking an actual number. If a brand was going to be more optimized for poison, of course, you'd want it to be base fizz and then convert over to chaos. On the other hand, if it was going to be hit only, then it being base chaos makes sense. So let's just leave the numbers up in the air here, along with the effectiveness of added damage. After all, in terms of design, the numbers are the easiest thing to change or fix later. The mechanical function is much harder. And since I want this to be usable for either chaos hit or poison, without being exclusive to either one, then it has that pretty good crit rate, and it will also activate every 0.4 seconds baseline, because hitting fairly quickly is very good for poison, and is important for another aspect of a brand that I'll get into in a moment. Now it would primarily deal its damage to a single target, meaning there's no AoE and there's no splash effect. This means you'll want your brands to be jumping around to deal the maximum damage possible when clearing. This also means you might want to use something like Plague Bearer or an explodey effect such as Profane Bloom, since the brand's single target will generally be good, but its clear will generally be a little bit on the weaker side compared to the other brand skills. As always with a brand skill, increases and reductions to cast speed will also apply to activation frequency. Now originally, I was envisioning it as a chaos hit skill, and so I was thinking maybe it would have the line from Hex Blast. Chaos damage with hits is resisted by lowest resistance instead, meaning you wouldn't have to descale enemy chaos res, which opens you up to do a bunch of other things. Except then I realized that's boring. We don't need just another chaos hit skill that's a worse version of Forbidden Right with far worse scaling. So instead, I came up with something which I feel is a little bit unique, and which ended up leading me to the problem of Wither and solving the Wither. That is, when Entropic Brand deals damage to an enemy, it plants an entropic seed, causing them to be withered and increasing the effect of Wither on that enemy. So, every time the brand jumps around and every time it damages an enemy, it's inflicting a Wither stack. If you have one brand on the enemy, this means it'll take you a little bit to ramp all the way up, but it's not terrible for a boss like Cirrus, especially if you already have good cast speed. And because the Withers inflicted by this brand have 1% increased effective Wither per 1% quality, combining it with Ashes of the Stars gives you 50% increased effective Wither, which makes it very powerful. This way you have a choice. Do you want the stronger Wither effect, but it ramps up more slowly, in which case you'd use Entropic Brand, or do you want a weaker Wither effect, but it ramps up very quickly, in which case you'd use Withering Step. The idea here is that Entropic Brand can function as a support skill for any other chaos skill. You won't have to reduce your mobility in order to wither the target efficiently, but even if you're withering the target more efficiently than, say, a Wither Totem, it's not going to be as fast to ramp up. On the other hand, if you're using it for a damage skill, the increased effective Wither means it'll hit significantly harder than it might have otherwise. I feel like this provides a really good balance of utility, damage, and efficiency. But if you think differently, let me know down in the comments what changes you'd make to Entropic Brand to make it better. And remember, the goal isn't to make it overpowered, the goal is to make it balanced, so I'm sure the damage would have some sort of tax or penalty to be associated with a high utility and Wither effect. Next up, another problem that's bothered me for quite a while is, if you're playing a bow build, you always want additional projectiles. And if you're playing a wand build, you also usually want additional projectiles for your single target. Now, bows have additional projectiles, so that isn't a problem, but wands don't really. But why should almost all projectile skills rely on more projectiles for their single target damage? And also, why is it almost always so much safer to get close to an enemy and use a point-blank playstyle than to stay far away and use far shot? Hence, Ballistic Impact Support. Ballistic Impact Support will support bow and wand skills. I'm sorry, if you were thinking that this would be great for your Spectral Helix or Spectral Throw build, that would probably be a bad idea. There's already a lot of weapon-specific supports that work with those. And there's very few wand-specific weapon supports. So Ballistic Impact is bow and wand only. Supported projectile skills are limited to a maximum of 1 projectile. Supported projectiles cannot split, pierce, chain, or fork because they explode instantly on impact with terrain or enemies. This skill can be used with forward-firing bow and wand skills. Supported skills deal 60 to 80% more damage, provided they have traveled at least 40 units. The idea here is you get a massive nuke skill, but it only hits once. Now, 60 to 80% more damage is a very big multiplier, and in fact, it might be too big. On the other hand, because you're losing the ability to scale projectiles, the way you normally would with, say, something like Barrage, well, it might be too small. It might need to be 160 to 180. I'm not really sure here, but the idea is that you're giving yourself a dead zone or a limitation that you have to play around in order to get this really big hard-hitting single-target nuke. And of course, if a random trash mob runs up to you, it's not a big deal because you're probably going to kill that even on a 5-link. Another important thing about this is the skill supported would not be able to generate secondary projectiles, which means if you're using a skill like Kinetic Bolt, Scourge Arrow, or Tornado Shot, you can't actually support it with this skill. The goal here is to give an alternative to Barrage support for builds where it doesn't really make sense, since there's a lot of clear skills, like Split Arrow, that work really well. But then, what do you use for single target? Because anything that you use for single target wants projectiles, but adding more projectiles to your Split Arrow doesn't really do all that much. And ideally, this would provide a nice balance and a nice middle ground. And now, I have one more idea, which if you're a fan of Melee, you'll probably want to check out. But before I talk about it, a quick reminder that if you're enjoying the video, be sure to leave a like, as it really helps out the YouTube algorithm, and it also tells me that people enjoy this and want to see more content like it. After you've done that, be sure to sub to the channel and ring the bell, so that you can know whenever I do upload my next Theorycraft video about adding skills to Path of Exile. And finally, we're coming to the end of Arch Nemesis. If you enjoyed Arch Nemesis and want something to commemorate it, then maybe check out my merch shop, where I have various themed shirts, including designs to celebrate both Arch Nemesis itself and also the Siege of Yatlas, along with some iconic lines from Path of Exile's history. As always, that'll be down in the description below. But now, let's start talking about hitting things with weapons. I don't know about you, but when I originally saw the Blood archetype, I imagined Reap to be an attack, not a spell. And I imagined it to have some sort of bleed synergy. This felt like it was needed since right now Bloodlust support exists, but it doesn't really do anything, and you're either playing a bleed build or you're playing a hit build. There really isn't any sort of middle ground in between. The closest I could think of would be Lacerate, but even that feels really bad as a hit-based skill and really good as a bleed skill. It feels like Bleed currently suffers from the exact same problem that Ignite used to, where you have Bleed skills, and Bleed isn't very good outside of those skills. And if you're doing Bleed, you're damage over time only, and then if you're hit-based, then you're not really doing Bleed. So the idea here is to bridge the gap a little bit. I'll admit it doesn't fully solve the problem, but it hopefully adds somewhat of a middle ground. And it comes in two forms. The first is Rend, a melee skill that's explicitly designed to scale around the idea of using Crimson Dance, putting some bleeds on the target, but not really being a bleed build. You lash out with a bladed weapon, rending the target's flesh, and dealing damage in such a way that you rip the blood out of their wounds. Rend requires an axe or sword, and will have special effects based on whether or not the target is bleeding. It'll be a fast attack at 100% of normal weapon attack speed, and it won't hit very hard, at 80 to 115% of weapon damage. Rend will be unable to inflict bleeding. However, Rend will deal 30% more damage per damaging bleed on an enemy, raising its damage effectiveness as high as 391%, assuming the target has 8 damaging bleeds on them. The reason the line damaging bleed is important here is, if you're just hitting the target and inflicting a bunch of bleeds, is to encourage you to use this with Crimson Dance specifically. As you might have Crimson Dance, and you might have a really good single target setup, but this way you don't really need to worry about stacking up all those bleeds for clear. And this is where the second portion of Rend comes in. Rend also removes all bleeds on the target to release a blood wave that gains an amount of base damage. It was hard for me here to think of exactly how much damage it would gain, and so I'm just going to say an amount of added base damage per damaging bleed removed. In other words, again, you want 8 on the target, and it gains +1 radius per bleed removed, regardless of if it's dealing damage to the enemy or not. The blood wave would then explode outwards from the enemy, damaging all nearby enemies, but not the initial target itself. So, essentially, you don't need to play a gladiator, and you don't need to wear hemophilia, and you can get all those nice bleed explosions. In terms of a damage pattern of a blood wave itself, I was thinking of a gigantic red snowflake, with each spike exploding out based on the cardinal directions and being able to deal damage. This way, it's not only visually different from most other explosions, but it should cover a wider range per radius. If something's a perfect circle, then it only goes so far. If you're extending spikes out in a limited way, you can extend the spikes farther without it being too overpowered because it's not going to hit absolutely everything. Though of course, if Rend itself hit multiple targets, then you'd get more spikes and therefore deal more damage. The reason that I have this be based on the number of bleeds on an enemy rather than the bleed damage itself is the idea is you're inflicting a bleed, but you're not doing very much damage with that bleed, which does fit very much into the Crimson Dance archetype and hopefully gives people more options. But I also mentioned Bloodlust support, and Bloodlust is where I think the damage the bleed does could matter. Right now, Bloodlust support says the supported skills cannot inflict bleed, and it just deals more damage to bleeding enemies, which is really boring and absolutely not worth building around. But what if that bleed mattered? Well, when I brought that up with a friend, their immediate answer was, yes, but you can break the game by just stacking a ton of duration and playing Bleed Earthquake, and having a 30 million plus damage bleed and converting all that into damage on the target. This is why Plaguebearer is in fact capped. So my thought for Bloodlust support is to make it kind of a hybrid between Shockwave support and Plaguebearer. Bloodlust support would now read, supported skills deal no damage with bleeding. When the supported skill strikes a target, it gains added reflective damage equal to 5 to 12% of the damage the bleed from this attack would have inflicted. So the idea here is you can't just make absolute giga bleeds using a separate skill. You'd have to make a giga bleed with the skill itself. The reason it's added reflected damage is to prevent the damage from actually scaling. The reflected damage would of course be physical, but we don't want to enable double dipping here. I think 5 to 12% is pretty reasonable, since if you want the skill to be hitting very hard, you'll need to kind of go all in on the bleed and do that whole giga juice bleed thing, but then that's your one super slow hard hitting attack, and if it doesn't kill the enemy, it'll take you a little bit to set the next one up. Remember, all of these numbers could easily be adjusted, and very likely I got some, if not most of the numbers wrong. Now, I didn't talk about a lot of the specifics, such as what level things will be, whether they're strength, dexterity, etc., but at the end of the day, I don't expect any of these to actually be implemented. And so I'm curious, what do you think of the 2 skills and 2 support gems I suggested in this video? Do you think they do a good job of fitting into Path of Exile's design space and solving some problems while not being overpowered? Do you think that they'd actually see use, or they'd go by the wayside as everyone rushes to something like minions? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, along with whether or not you'd like to see more videos like this in the future. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, be sure to put them down in the comments below, or join the Discord, where you can ask questions, get build help, and hang out with the community. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members. They're awesome, and they get to show it by having their name on screen in the credits of all my videos. So if you want to see your name here, be sure to check the link in the description. For more general gaming content, check out my second channel, 10 Gaming Thoughts, and if you want a water bottle or a cool shirt, I have a link to my official merch shop in the description. I hope you learned something today, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.